Well, yeah, thanks everyone. Thanks for having me today. I appreciate being asked to kind of nerd out on package management because it's something that I've cared about for a fair wee while. So there's 3 talks, I think, from Homebrew maintainers happening in this conference. And I'm going to kind of do like a deep dive into Homebrew and some of the stuff that I kind of have seen with Homebrew that's kind of worked well, not working well, a little bit of history and stuff like that. So let's have a wee walk through for you. So my name's Mike McQuaid. Nice to meet you. I know some of the folks who are watching this. I'm sure I've met a bunch of you already, and I hope to meet many more. And you can get in contact with me if you have any kind of thoughts or questions about either this talk or Homebrew in general. Then get in touch on Twitter or through my email, which is on my GitHub or whatever. So I've been working on Homebrew for about 12 years now, and I've been the project leader, I guess, for 3 or so. And yeah, it's a really pretty interesting project to work on, and it's a pretty interesting package manager. So let's have a wee walk through these things. So as I mentioned before, what I'm going to talk through today is the history of Homebrew and how that sort of has informed where Homebrew is today and some of the kind of original design decisions and stuff like that. Things that Homebrew does well, from my perspective at least, compared to other package managers. Things that it does badly, and then moving on from these, the things that Homebrew can't really change, that it does not very well, and some stuff that we have planned for future, which will hopefully be some good changes. So let's start off with the history. So I'm going to actually walk through, interestingly, with Homebrew. It's one of these ones where the whole development from day one pretty much is in the open, and you can kind of review all that stuff. So you can actually go all the way back in the Git logs. We've moved repositories over the years on GitHub, but we have been diligent in kind of maintaining all our Git history. So in the Homebrew Brew repository, you can see the original commit for Homebrew that was made by Max Howell, the original creator, on 21st of May, 2009. So like this kind of README sort of describes how the project works at this stage. I mean, it's fairly different even within a few months of this. So I think I was involved, I don't know, like 3-4 months after he sort of did this original commit. I sort of knew Max. He was a friend of a friend, and we both, I think, were working in London at the time. But it's interesting to see how many of these kind of concepts are still integral to Homebrew 12 years on. So I'm not going to read through everything here. And if you can't read all the text here, then A, you can go and check out this link and see the text there if you want to. But B, also, like, I'm just going to gloss over stuff, and you can go back and get back to it later if you're interested. So the first thing here that's sort of notable is this kind of idea that, like, say if you're installing wget, embedded within a version directory. So you've got wget /1.14 bin wget. I think that was inspired originally by Gobu Linux, which does something similar. It might have been something that did that before Gobu Linux, but this idea that every software and every version of the software is in an individually versioned prefix, which are then symlinked back so that you can kind of, use a, user local bin wget, but that actually points to user local seller wget 1.14 bin wget, for example. So this still remains the same. And as Max says, you kind of use the file system as the package database, which is kind of nice because it's less preserved state and we don't need to implement like a database package store or whatever. So the next thing, again, the stuff that remains the same today that's sort of interesting with the original approaches with Homebrew are we kind of still try and use sort of dependencies from a Mac OS system when they're available for us. We also still don't run as root. There's a few exceptions we're a little bit more liberal on than we used to, with stuff like running in Docker containers on Linux, and we can still be installed anywhere. But I guess, as I'll talk about in this talk, basically almost anything you could do with Homebrew back then, you still can do with Homebrew now, but the difference being there's parts that we support now compared to before, where it was, arguably everything was supported and nothing was supported. So moving forward, like, Homebrew doesn't really work quite the same way as this. The really first versions were literally you were just calling a Ruby script and you're executing with Ruby, whereas now we have this kind of brew command. But again, still you can see most of these operations kind of seeing the installed size of a package on disk by using typical Unix file system utilities and stuff like that. So there's even a little touch on here where Max sort of debates whether or not we should add a brew command, but says that, if you don't add it, then you'll understand what the system is better. And obviously we did have a brew command eventually, and I think there's still a certain amount of understanding, but I think it shows kind of the real technical focus for the original Homebrew users were expected to kind of, know their way around the Unix command line very well and not just use it as a tool for installing stuff, which might be the first Unix command line tool that they use. I still think there's that middle paragraph where it talks about with apt-get, you don't really know what's happening with the Homebrew you do. Obviously, despite the fact we have like a brew install command now, our kind of formula, which is what we call our package descriptions in Homebrew, are still fairly readable. If you look through, it's fairly, there's a little bit more magic than there used to be, but it's still fairly obvious like what commands are being run under the hood to actually make it work. So there's some kind of opinions here about like Mac ports, which at the time was the kind of main competitor, I guess, that Homebrew was kind of seeking to replace. And, we've both found their own little individual niches that kind of make sense for Mac ports and Homebrew. And this sort of, Mac ports installing its own libz, OpenSSL, et cetera, stuff like that. Like Homebrew still tries to take this methodology where we can. Unfortunately, with stuff like OpenSSL, we've got to the point where compared to back in the Leopard days, the system OpenSSL is so outdated at this point. Well, it's the LibreSSL firstly, but it's, it doesn't work for a lot of things that we need it to. So unfortunately, we have to rely there. But we still try and use what we can from the macOS system when we can. And also the stuff that Homebrew will never build. So, I mean, all of these have been broken in some form. So KDE GNOME, we don't package that stuff in Homebrew proper, but something else does. There's various taps that kind of you can use, taps being third-party Homebrew repositories that use these type of things. Anything that can be distributed in an app bundle, again, sort of. So Homebrew can install those, but that's kind of separate to formula. That's Homebrew Cask, which was then merged into Homebrew itself. So you can brew install Google Chrome, but that's kind of using a completely different way of doing that. Anything that needs to install outside the Homebrew tree, same deal. Stuff in the Homebrew tree is done by formula. Stuff that needs to go outside the Homebrew tree is done by casks. And stuff OS X, now macOS, already does. Ruby gems, duplication sucks. So like we do a little bit more duplication. We will now package some stuff in Ruby gems, NPM, whatever, but generally only applications if you don't care about the fact that they're written in JavaScript or Ruby or whatever it may be. But we don't go and take the, say, Debian approach, or at least Debian approach a few years ago, and go and try and package, every library that we use for an NPM application or whatever it may be. So compiling from source is an interesting thing. So Homebrew is essentially still under the hood, a from source package manager, but we built binaries, which we call bottles, on top instead. So now we actually only support building binary packages and users consuming those binary packages. We have a build from source fallback, which is what we are using in CI to build those binary packages, but that we don't really support that. It's, over the years, we just found it was far too error prone to continue to support like from source package installation. And again, like with Homebrew being originally a macOS package manager, we wanted to kind of keep the focus on stuff that works out the box. That we kind of like Apple does. We would rather offer less knobs to twiddle, but a system which works better most of the time. So I guess, of course, that's very debatable whether Apple works better, but it's my talk, so I guess I can say what I want. How do we notify someone as a package out of date? Again, this points to the fact that Homebrew from the outset was using GitHub very heavily. And this is, again, something we still do to this day. And the kind of contribution focus in Homebrew is still very, very strong. And then finally, the thing people always ask, Homebrew obviously has this beer theme that started from the outset. And yes, Homebrew was originally devised under the influence of alcohol. So these themes, which I think still apply with Homebrew today, about avoiding duplication, a fairly focused scope, not doing things necessarily other package managers might for you, community ownership of the package manager rather than it being entirely done by Macs or their maintainers, and making contribution very easy. I think those stand on and set the kind of foundation for where the package manager is today. So this segues nicely into the things I think Homebrew does well. So going back to that, contributions. So we've had over, I guess, between the two repositories, probably over 10,000 contributors to Homebrew at this point over a 10-year period. People have asked in the past, like, how have we done that? How have we got so many contributors? And I think part of that is making it very easy. So we have a community that's very welcoming to people. There's sometimes a expression that I've heard people say where they talk about, the drive-by contributors and pull requests that people just submit one and then they forget and they never come back to the project. In my mind, like, if that is not useful to your project, then that's a sign that you set expectations maybe a little bit badly of what your project wants and what they don't. We have a lot of people who've only contributed once, but it's been really useful. And we have created dedicated tooling to make it much easier to do this. So in our documentation on how to open a pull request, the most common thing people were doing, we would find, would be submitting a pull request to change a version. We call it bumping a version. So increasing the version of a package to the newest version that's come out. So we have a dedicated tool, Brew Bump Formula PR, which you can specify a package name and the new version and stuff like that. And it will actually not only make the changes for you locally, commit them to Git, but it opens the pull request for you. And it's pretty cool to be able to see people being able to create pull requests without really any understanding of Git, without really any understanding of what Homebrew is doing underneath the hood, but just following steps in documentation. And that's their way of getting involved with the community. And it's actually useful for us as well, because that saves us kind of for having to check this stuff manually. Stepping onwards from different stuff that Homebrew does. So another thing I think we do fairly well is doing things for the user. So in this screenshot, you can see I'm upgrading a package here, so upgrading shell check. But this is actually doing a couple of things which had to be done somewhat manually. So it's updating Homebrew itself, effectively running a brew update command for you before it does anything. So this was a change that we made a few years ago to basically reduce the amount of support requests we were getting, because we were getting tons of support requests, which were 90%, probably 95, maybe 99% were resolved by run brew update and try again. So this basically means that with auto update by default, people are always getting the latest version of Homebrew and the latest version of the packages. And this makes more sense from our perspective, but I'll come more onto that later. So this is updating Homebrew. It's upgrading the package for you, downloading it, etc. And then it's running brew cleanup afterwards to kind of clean up the old versions of the package and the kind of old cache files and stuff like that. Again, we didn't used to do this by default automatically for people, but Homebrew ended up taking up more and more space, and your average user didn't understand why. So another thing Homebrew I think does really well, I'm biased of course because I am a Homebrew maintainer, but we really prioritize the kind of health and the mental health of our maintainers. We've got documents on how to avoid burnout, and we try and set the expectation in general that in the project that if you have to choose between a maintainer suffering and a contributor suffering, or a maintainer suffering and a user suffering, and those levels of suffering are roughly equal, then we are always going to prioritize the maintainer. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, the project without any maintainers ceases to exist, all activity stops, and we don't have an open source project anymore. And assuming that every maintainer, as the maintainer guide to avoiding burnout says, is using Homebrew, then we can't have no users. Because so long as we have one maintainer, we have one user. Whereas if we only have users who aren't contributing and who aren't maintaining the package manager, then we don't have a package manager anymore, effectively. So this is something I would advise you to do. I personally have taken some quite strong views on this in the past. You can check out this blog post that I recommend. If you're a package manager, maintainer, I recommend you read this and really internalize this, because it's really hard to get your head around the idea that you don't actually owe anyone anything when it comes to open source. Everything you do is from the principle of charity, and that's great. And you can do that. And it's very nice to do things. And there are things which I feel obligated to do, and I do them because I want to try and be nice, but you don't have to do them. And particularly when people are being entitled jerks, you do not have to do them, and you do not have to fix legitimate bugs from entitled jerks. So that's me on my soapbox briefly. But I do think this focus on, for a relatively long period, on kind of maintainers, some people don't like it, but the maintainers in the project seem to like it, and it seems to keep people around for a reasonable amount of time and allow them to have a good time on Homebrew, which means they spend more time on Homebrew. So I guess my summary of stuff we do well: community ownership of the project. It's not just owned by the maintainers. We expect our users to get involved, but we make it easy to contribute. We have fairly sensible defaults, so we don't expect you to kind of just know to run a command after you run some other command. We either tell you to do it or we do it for you, and then we prioritize maintainers. Things we do badly. So wait a second, this is the same. Oh no, aha. This is me being very clever here, because like in most software development, there are trade-offs. So these are the things that we prioritize in Homebrew, but you could equally, and some people do, if you read comments in places like Hack and Use, flip this around to the other way around. So instead of community ownership, you could say, well, our maintainers don't take sufficient ownership. Instead of user contribution being a good thing, we could say, well, we punt things off to our users rather than doing them ourselves. Instead of good defaults, we could say, well, for power users, the defaults are bad. And also the defaults keep changing over the years. And instead of saying we're prioritizing maintainers, just saying, well, Homebrew is just trying to do all they can to kind of close issues and use stale bots and lock bots and whatever. So I think these are valid criticisms of the project. These are valid trade-offs that I think we're making, but it's worth pointing out what these trade-offs look like. So this is an example of a fairly normal issue that's created, where someone said, okay, I installed this package using Homebrew, it's broken. But in Homebrew, in our case, we don't maintain issues, and we don't try and fix packages that we have, which are like broken, which are basically out of our responsibility. So we've got two maintainers here, Bo98 and S. Miller Dev, who are saying, yeah, upstream need to fix this, and we're going to close this because Homebrew is not going to keep track of this indefinitely. Similarly, on a pull request where someone says, oh, this thing fails, Sean Miller is saying here, yeah, could you make a pull request to update this? Because the person there seems to be the one affected, and they seem to be the one who knows what needs to be changed. So it makes sense to Sean and to me that that person would submit a pull request to make those fixes. So on to defaults. So everything on this slide, so analytics, auto update, boot snap, checking dependents, cleaning up formula after installation, and this slide, not using the GitHub API, no insecure redirects, not doing cleanup after install, and not automatically upgrading install outdated formula. Like, various people over the years have argued that, well, firstly, in Homebrew, none of these used to be the case. These used to, I think, with a couple of exceptions, these used to almost all be the default behavior. And everyone has argued, someone has argued for every single one of these over the years that they should be the default. But we decide the defaults that we do based on prioritizing the 99% case, the people who use Homebrew most often. And most of the time, we want Homebrew to install things, fix things up. If we think that we may have broken something, we would rather do an upgrade that was unnecessary, for example, or a reinstall that was like detected, if broken linkage was detected or whatever, and make an installation take a little bit longer than you might have expected, but produce a result that's correct at the end. And some people don't like that behavior, but we think that's the best for users overall. Similarly, we have a Homebrew developer command that you can get auto-opted into by running certain commands, which puts you on a beta channel of Homebrew. Again, this is very useful for our user testing, but some people don't like this. But like, if we had an opt-in testing there, we would have much fewer people in it. So we would rather prioritize what's easier for us. Similarly, on our issues, we now have these kind of required issue templates with required fields you have to fill in. No doubt this is a little bit harder for people to fill in, maybe takes a little bit more time and requires more information from them. But this allows maintainers time to be prioritized so that we can jump in and have the information we need when someone submits an issue rather than having back and forth. So this leads us on to things about Homebrew which are a bit broken that we can't change. So one is our version support. Our version support isn't really great. You can go and read our documentation, but effectively you're just creating multiple formula because Homebrew doesn't have the concept internally of depending on a particular version. So we just have a version being outdated or it's not outdated. And if it's outdated, we upgrade it. And if something depends on something that's outdated, it gets upgraded as part of the installation. So similarly, installing old versions of formula, like people are like, oh, well, can't you just install the old version from the Git history? No, sadly not, because that stuff breaks all the time because we have to make changes as macOS changes and the like. Our installation process, people would love it if we supported the non-default installation paths. But if you use the non-default ones, you don't get binary packages. And if you don't get binary packages, we're not testing what you're doing in CI and things may be broken. So we don't support those because we don't have the volunteer time to be able to do so. I'm almost at the end, so I'm just going to fire through quickly. Our terminology, similarly, we can't really change this at this point without confusing existing users. We're written in Ruby. There's upsides and downsides of that, but it slows things down a little bit. So we can't really rewrite Homebrew from scratch, not in Ruby. And particularly our DSL is very heavily reliant on Ruby. But stuff we are planning on changing in the nearest future. So we plan on allowing formula to be installed without having to have Homebrew Core or Homebrew Cask checked out on disk. So they take up a lot of space and they take a long time to fetch and clone and update. So that will be a big win when we're able to ship this by default, but you can try this out now with this Homebrew install from API flag. We hope to have more binary packages be relocatable, which means you can install Homebrew anywhere and they will be used. And if we ever get to a point where 100% of our binary packages are like this, then we'll allow you to install Homebrew anywhere, which would be great. But you can check out what stuff we have planned from our help wanted labels on our repository. So things that Homebrew does, like that's coming in future, you can expect some faster updates, hopefully some more relocatable bottles, and maybe other stuff. Who knows what the future will hold. So yeah, sorry I've run a little bit late with this. I don't know if we have any time for questions or not. But thank you everyone for coming and listening, and thank you for everyone who has contributed to or maintained Homebrew over the years. We couldn't have done it without you. So I'm seeing some questions on the screen. I'm going to read off the screen and answer the questions if I see them. Given that you have to package OpenSSL, do you find it valuable to say, try not to package all your dependencies? Would you move to a model where you did that, or would it be worse? So in my opinion, I think it's still valuable to use things from the OS where they're provided, so like zlib, OpenSSL, whatever, because it just saves time. And it means that you can defer more of those security things to the OS provider. As I say, OpenSSL is an example where we don't do that anymore, but there's still cases where we do, and I still think it provides value rather than being like consistent with everything and packaging everything ourselves.
Guess it doesn't let me say things if I'm not on screen. Here's the second question for you.
Oh yeah, another question. So if all the versions are removed automatically, does it make sense to prefix the installation by version? Maybe not anymore, but I think it still does, because you can, because of the existing like foundation of the old way things worked, you can turn off that behavior, and then you can get like keep versions around and have that different behavior. But also, I still think it's still useful to be able to segment things in that way, because that means that if you're upgrading a package, you know reliably that you can destroy everything within the old version's prefix. Whereas if you prefix the installation by name after that, then you would have to do some sort of swapping back and forth. Whereas this way, the swapping is only done with a symlink to the version, which can be cleaned up afterwards.
All right, that is all. Thanks for the talk, Mike. And well, if folks have more questions, you can ask them on the Element Room that we have, or on Gather.town.
Yeah, I'm going to head over to the Element Room now and hopefully answer any other questions people have. But thanks so much, everyone, for having me. And thanks, Padyan, for organizing.
Thanks. See you over there.